Want to see me re-release the same game? You want to see me do it again? You want to see me do it again?
I've been playing a lot of video game remakes as of late, of games from my childhood and stories that I'm experiencing for the first time. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we're currently going through an age of remakes, and not just for video games. Media giants like Disney have been digging up the graves of every one of their major IPs to see just how much money they can beat out of them. Not to mention, most of these stories were already derivative of existing folktales to begin with. But you can't just re-release the movies, you gotta add a little something new, so classic films are remade into live action. I made a video several months back about live action adaptations and why so many of them end up falling flat. While some of the criticisms I made in that video still carry over to games, video game remakes function very differently than other media. With old video games, you don't just need a physical copy of the game, but also compatible hardware to be able to play it, which makes for an additional barrier to entry for people who want to check out older titles. Sure, you could hop online and buy a Dreamcast or NES, but having to purchase a whole system if you only really want to play one game or two is a bit much. There's a greater precedent to re-release games on modern platforms to make them accessible to a larger audience and preserve those titles. Otherwise, they'll just be lost to time. Remakes aren't a modern invention. Most early home console releases were just games taken from the arcade. Arcade cabinets were much more powerful than consoles back then, so the games had to be redesigned to run on weaker hardware. Nowadays, we just call that a switch port. Major players in the arcade industry like Konami and Capcom would have a ton of their games thrown onto a cartridge for home consoles. It was a simple and efficient way to fill up a console's library. While re-releases are great for accessibility, there's also no denying that it's easy money. I mean, what's the alternative? Coming up with something fresh and original? As console hardware caught up to the arcade cabinets, there was less downgrading games from the arcade and more titles being released straight to console. But the re-releasing never stopped. The games just started to hop from console to console without any significant changes being made. These ported over versions were just that. Ports. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who would call The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess on the Wii a remake of the GameCube version, especially considering the fact that they were released alongside each other. If a game is old enough, or if a company wants to make some free money, then you get a remaster, an upgraded version of the original with graphical enhancements and maybe even some quality of life changes, which in concept is great. Not every game ages so gracefully. Some design decisions end up feeling archaic and some controls feel clunky. With the remaster, developers can revisit old games and fix up parts that were lacking due to things like time constraints or technical limitations. No matter how much you hate change, I think there are some things we can agree are definite improvements. If a game has long loading screens, most folks aren't going to miss that in a remaster. Most, not all. People get sentimental about quite literally everything. Me personally, I still love to get physical media and play games on original hardware, even when it's not the most convenient option. A couple years back, I picked up copies of the first two Kingdom Hearts games, dusted off the old PS2 Slim, and even finessed a CRT TV from my grandma to get the full early 2000s experience. I got a few hours in before dying to a boss, resetting at a checkpoint and realizing, you can't skip cutscenes in this game. Ever. I turned that shit off with a quickness about the HD Remaster Collection. On paper, remasters should be the best version of their respective games, but not all remasters are created equally. More often than not, you just get what's basically a port with minimal enhancements, usually HD graphics and 60 FPS if you're lucky. Any excuse to add something to the title is a good one, because it's far better for marketing than just saying the same exact game you played but with a new price tag. Atlas got me fucked up thinking I'm gonna pay $60 for an additional 30 FPS. That's $2 per frame, per second, and it's rarely ever the games that really need the remaster that get them. Marvel's Spider-Man dropped in 2018 and got remastered just 2 years later. Not much was enhanced because there wasn't much to enhance. It got ray tracing, faster load times, and compatibility with Sony's new $70 vibrator. When compared side by side, you can definitely see a difference with the remaster. But nobody was asking for this, and it was made purely to be bundled with Miles Morales and resold as a launch title for the PS5, because as we all know, PS5 ain't got no games. Need for Speed Hot Pursuit is a 2010 reboot of a 1998 game that was remastered for 8th gen consoles and PC. It includes all the DLC, introduced crossplay, and enhanced the visuals. At least that's what it says on the box. They actually reuse the same car models. Some textures look marginally better and some look outright worse, but most things look the same as they ever did. EA also shoehorns their own launcher into their Steam releases. A lot of major publishers do, because you know, every PC player loves launching a launcher to launch another launcher to launch the game that they want to play. At least with PC games, we have the option to go back and buy the original at a cheaper price.
You can't keep getting away with it!
The most egregious kind of re-release is the replacement. New version just dropped, remove the old game from all digital storefronts. When a game is remastered for the latest console generation, it makes sense why that'd be the only version available on those platforms. They're not going to release a port alongside the remaster. But on PC, where the brand new releases are going to be sharing shelf space along with the old ones, there's no good reason to delist that version, especially with single player games. Rockstar notoriously released a remastered compilation of GTA games with character models that look significantly worse than they did on the PS2, removed the original games from stores, and cracked down on fan-made mods to make their new version the only way to access these titles. Calling a game the Definitive Edition is always a bold move, telling players, hey, this is the best way to experience this thing, like they can't make that decision for themselves. If a re-release really is that good, the community will naturally migrate to that version, but both games should be supported until that happens. For the most part, but it's a lot more understandable to stop supporting a game with 20 active players than cutting it off the very moment you drop some new shit. Nintendo as a company is allergic to two things: good PR decisions and supporting their legacy content. Super Smash Bros. Melee is one of the most beloved fighting games to ever exist, and the only way to play it, legally, is to own a 22-year-old disc and console. While technically not remasters, Smash sequels effectively serve the same purpose. They have the same character roster plus dozens more, over 100 new and old stages, updated graphics. From Nintendo's point of view, why would you ever want to play Melee when you can just cop that new for $59.99? The Virtual Console was a solid way to experience what old titles it offered, but that all disappeared when Nintendo closed the eShop earlier this year, and no game series suffered quite like Pokemon. With both the 3DS and Wii U losing their digital stores, another 33% of all Pokemon games were made unavailable to purchase through official avenues. You either gotta sell your soul to a reseller or set sail for the One Piece. These games basically never get ported over to modern platforms. Instead, they get the most divisive kind of re-release: the remake. Remakes are also the most loosely defined, with some more closely resembling a remaster and others being complete reimaginings. They're rebuilt from the ground up in a new engine with new assets, new voice acting, and rearranged and reorchestrated music. Remakes can be a great way to revisit old games you've already played while still recapturing that sense of experiencing something for the first time. While I had a lot of fun with some of the modern Pokemon remakes, and others I more so tolerated, I wouldn't call any of them a replacement for the originals, but that's exactly how Nintendo treats them. As I mentioned earlier, there are some changes that can pretty much be agreed upon as objectively good. Most mythical Pokemon are only obtainable through in-person events. Although events are good because they get gamers to leave the damn house, they also make these Pokemon unavailable to players outside of certain regions, and unavailable to everyone after a certain time period. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire took Deoxys, who was previously event only, and made it available in the base game, which is a great change all around. But Pokemon remakes also have changes like mandatory XP share, altered catching mechanics, and affection, among other contentious things that draw a clear line between the remakes and the OGs. I don't think that remakes are always cash grabs, but it's pretty damn easy to identify when one is. Tell me, what is your purpose?
Your life is nothing. You serve zero purpose.
The Last of Us Part 1 has no reason to exist. The original released in 2013 for the PS3 and got remastered a year later for the PS4. 8 years after that, we got a PS5 remake where everything was rebuilt from the ground up, especially that price tag. The remake is graphically superior, but the remaster absolutely still holds up. If any game has an original release, remake, and remaster all within a decade time span, that's a pretty clear red flag. Not a single person alive was asking for this. Sony just wanted to have a new $70 release to coincide with the television series. It's no coincidence that's the version that got ported to PC, nor is it a coincidence that it was ported just 2 weeks after the show's season finale. Much like what Sony did with Spider-Man, the Demon's Souls remake was made purely to sell PS5s. It was a vehicle to show how powerful the console was, so graphics were prioritized over everything. Too much was changed artistically to consider it a remaster, and not enough was changed mechanically to say it's a complete reimagining of the 2009 game. Oh, a pre-order bonus, my favorite part of FromSoft games. Despite the cynical approach to the remake, I personally enjoyed it a lot. Granted, I never played the original game, but for the people who did, I can get why they might not like this version. With the massive portion of the audience for any remake being fans of the original, nostalgia is naturally going to play a huge role in how that remake is received. There's a reason why we get remakes of beloved classics like RE4 and not, Mr. Mosquito for the PS2. That existing audience is guaranteed money, but it also guarantees a group of players who will complain about any minor deviation. There are a ton of valid things to criticize about remakes, but you occasionally see the odd complaint like the NPC, Bumblefuck McNobody, got his hair color changed from brown to black. I wanted to avoid those kinds of criticisms and approach a remake without any nostalgia clouding my judgment, so that's exactly what I did with one particular game that I want to take a closer look at. Final Fantasy VII is a classic that I'd never played. It was a game I had on the back burner for the longest time, but for one reason or another, I never got around to it. If you've ever touched a PlayStation, it'd be hard to have never heard of Final Fantasy, especially 7. It's gone far past just being a game and has seeped into mainstream pop culture. As a fan of games and a member of the Italian Senate, I'm obviously familiar with the main cast of characters and bits and pieces of the story, but definitely not enough to be nostalgic about them. I went into the original largely blind and came out of it with a new game in my list of all-time favorites. Not even a day later, I dove straight into the remakes before the rose-tinted glasses could set in to see how it compares. FF7 is nearly 3 decades old at this point, and the mind-blowing 3D visuals of the late 90s aren't going to seem so impressive to a modern audience. To me and other people who enjoy playing old games, the original art is still uniquely charming, but as with most remakes, the graphics are the first thing to be rebuilt. 7 Remake is non-stop eye candy. I'm not an old head who shakes his fist and complains about those darn realistic graphics. They have their place and offer unique strengths. The modern Unreal Engine approach brings Midgard to life in ways that were previously impossible. Everything from the opening to the first boss fight was perfection. After the mission, when you're making your way back to the slums, you're forced through the wreckage caused by the bomb. You see the pain and hear the cries of the people directly impacted by your actions. The remake does a better job of making Avalanche morally gray and humanizing the folks topside. When you're down in the slums, you can look up and see that big-ass pizza in the sky. You walk past nameless NPCs and hear them having full-on conversations with each other that elicit this feeling of Sonder. The world feels lived in and interconnected, but with hyper-realism, immersion is broken much harder when the cracks do start to show. NPCs are obviously going to have finite voice lines and have to loop at some point.
Why don't you learn to take a hint, buddy?
Wait, what the... Huh, that's weird.
Why don't you learn to take a hint, buddy?
Uh-oh. Whew, okay.
Why don't you learn to take a hint?
Unique designs will also be finite and have to be reused to repopulate crowds. In Sector 5, you'll see the same exact woman in a crowd near the center of the town, approaching that same crowd near the center of the town, sitting at a table a few meters away, eating some air sandwiches and drinking some oxygen brewskis with the homies, then over here in this alleyway trying to get some kids to stop playing on the roof, and finally one more block down trying to get the perfect squat form. These kinds of inconsistencies are much easier to forgive or simply ignore with the more abstract, stylized art styles. The new approach isn't outright better or worse, just different. 7's combat also saw a complete overhaul. Turn-based RPGs are far from dead, but they aren't as prominent as they once were. Old mechanics like random encounters are slowly being phased out of RPGs in favor of something more interactive, and it was obvious that Remake would do something similar. It tries to marry classic turn-based Final Fantasy with modern real-time action. Of course, FF7 wouldn't be FF7 without ATB, Materia, and limit breaks, and each of these elements were rebuilt to fit the new combat system. ATB now only dictates when each character can use spells, abilities, and items. You're free to move around and use basic attacks whenever. The ATB gauge slowly fills up over time like before, but you can fill it up faster by attacking. Limit breaks, status effects, and enemy weaknesses are left largely unchanged and are still as potent as they were in the original. I've heard people calling the game hack and slashy with damage sponges for enemies, and while you can certainly play it like that, you'd be shooting yourself in the foot. As with any good combat system, it's ultimately what you make of it. You can power through ignoring weaknesses and only using the most basic moves, sure, but you'll encounter a lot more resistance from the game and probably have less fun than if you were to fully interact with all of the mechanics the game offers you. The combat is super flexible, and you can come up with a ton of different strategies. Despite the real-time action, just like in the original, most of your decision making is done in the menu by playing around with your balls. The game's basic dodge roll is pitiful. It has no iframes and doesn't cover enough distance to be a reliable way to avoid attacks. I get the feeling that to keep in line with the hybrid turn-based concept, they wanted to place a greater emphasis on strategizing rather than dodging everything like it's Dark Souls, considering you can't move at all in turn-based combat. And again, this is something that can be mitigated with the proper setup. If you want a perfect parry attacks or solo no-hit super bosses with your favorite character, with the right loadout and strategy, you can. Another way the remake reimagines turn-based elements is by having the enemy AI always focus whichever character you're controlling, while the AI for your party members is brain dead. This forces you to constantly shuffle between all three characters to build and spend their ATB. You can't just stick to one character and have to issue commands to each party member directly like you would in the original. It's not the first game to try a hybrid turn-based real-time system, but I think it's definitely the best executed. I get why some people would still prefer something purely turn-based, but anybody saying this combat system has no depth is lying to you. The most polarizing changes in the remakes have to be the ones made to the story. The best parts of remake is that it expands on the original story. The worst part of remake is that it expands on the original story. Let's start with the good. Like I mentioned before, the remake does a lot more to humanize the villains so they actually seem like characters. The main cast also got some new scenes and dialogue where they bounce off each other better than they ever have before. The game has incredibly strong characterization. The writers understand exactly what makes these characters so loved, and they're at their absolute best in remake. Minigames and other minor scenes I didn't expect to see remade were still carried over. Granted, some changes had to be made to a better appeal to modern sensibilities. Wait, what are you doing? Wait, Tifa, no, don't say it, don't do it, they'll cancel you. You spend more time with minor characters like Jessie, so that when she dies, you actually feel something. She does die, right? Well, that's up in the air, because for about 70% of the game, you're going to be playing through a faithful recreation of the original story. The other 30% is split between completely new content or blatant padding trying to pass off as new content. Remember how I said everything was perfect up until the first boss fight? That's because right after that, we see Sephiroth, a character we're not supposed to encounter for several more hours. Sephiroth was built up endlessly in the original. For most of the game, you don't even see him, but instead see the sometimes literal trail of blood that follows wherever he goes. The same enemies you struggle with, he kills in one blow. The power gap between you and the big bad Sephiroth is constantly reinforced by the story and gameplay, making it hit that much harder when you finally do fight him. But in the remake, he shows up every other minute to flirt with his favorite twink.
I am your everything. Isn't that what you want? Don't deny me. Embrace me. A touching reunion. I'm waiting, Cloud.
After the first boss, we're also introduced to the plot ghosts, the physical manifestation of the planet's will to stick to the story of the original game. No, I'm not making this up. They show up whenever something goes off course and try to steer it back. The game concludes with you defeating the plot ghost and opening up the future to endless possibilities. These ghosts are a not so subtle metaphor for the pressure from fans to adhere to the original story of Final Fantasy VII. And the writers use this as a vehicle for meta-commentary on the nature of remakes and reimagining an iconic piece of art. While the execution is ham-fisted to say the least, I find myself agreeing with the creative team's desire to deviate because the remake isn't trying to replace the first game. Through playing the game, it's evident that 7 Remake is intended to be more of a companion piece to the original than anything. It's littered with references and callbacks to the first game and the media surrounding it. It heavily relies on players having existing knowledge of the original events. This is a game for the fans. They didn't spend any time building up Sephiroth because the target audience has already experienced that. The cat's been out of the bag for over 2 decades and there was no recapturing that same feeling of tension. But what about new fans? A common criticism I hear about remakes is that regardless of whether they're trying to replace the original or not, they inevitably lead to newcomers choosing to forgo the original in favor of the shiny new game. That many players will have their first experience with a classic game ruined by an inferior version. While there's definitely something to be said about misleading marketing being used to try to capture a new audience, most of those players, and I cannot stress this enough, were never gonna peep that shit in the first place. The casual audience doesn't dig through libraries of 30-year-old consoles for gems they may have missed. They want that shiny new version. For anybody who does care about getting the authentic experience, it should be immediately clear that a modern Unreal Engine action RPG is naturally going to produce a very different experience no matter how faithful they try to adapt the story. Those who care to see where it all started are going to go back and pick up the first game. In fact, it was seeing the remake that ultimately pushed me to pull FF7 from the backlog. But with a game I never had interest in playing like Dead Space, I jumped in with the 2023 version. Survival horror was never something that clicked with me, but I surprisingly had fun with that remake. Because of that, I wanted to try out some other games in that genre. And just a couple months later, the remake for Resident Evil 4 dropped, which everyone seemed to love. I wouldn't know, I never played it. I chose to buy the original before diving into the remake because that's something I'm interested in experiencing both versions of. If it's a game I care about, I'm gonna go back and play the original. I don't know, maybe I'm the weird one, but I find it hard to believe that there's some epidemic of gamers who wanted to play an old game but instead get their cherry popped by its remake, especially with games that are so readily available. Both FF7 and RE4 are available on current and last-gen consoles. They've been released on PC, iOS, and Android. Resi 4 is even on the Zeebo. What's a Zeebo? Fuck if I know, but the game's on there. These remakes aren't replacing the old ones, so it doesn't matter to me if they're not one-for-one recreations. A remake of Metal Gear Solid 3 was announced just last week during Sony's PlayStation Showcase. Now, I don't trust Konami to not fumble this remake. Luckily, they also revealed that they'd be releasing a collection of the first 3 games on PS5. Now, it would be really cool if the remake was a fresh new take on the game that was also fun, but it could also be an isometric turn-based battle royale / dating sim. I honestly couldn't care less because those original games are being preserved for a modern audience. Remakes will never be the same exact game, even if that's what the creators set out to make, because there will always be something off about the new game that alienates some fans. And the more time passes before something is remade, the more any modern attempt to recreate it is naturally going to deviate. FF7 Remake saw many of the key staff members from the first game returning. The original director, Yoshinori Kitase, was now the producer, whereas the role of director was taken over by Tetsuya Nomura, who did the original character designs and helped write the story. This guy is not known for his strong writing or subtlety. He's also the director for Kingdom Hearts, so when fans saw Remake go off the rails with metatextual ghosts and parallel dimensions, they were quick to put the blame on him. The remake could have been saved if Nomura wasn't the director. He ruined the story with his convoluted writing, and the rest of the staff just slurped at whatever terrible ideas he shat out.
We do indeed keep on slurping it up, as you say.
Hey yo, what the fuck? In actuality, his contributions to the remake was instrumental in preserving much of the story that fans know and love. In a 2020 interview with the head staff, it was revealed that it was Yoshinori Kitase who actually wanted to make more drastic changes to the story, but it was Nomura and his co-director Hamaguchi who dialed things back. Similarly, during development of the original game, it was Nomura's input that gave us one of the most iconic scenes in video games, instead of whatever the hell this is that they were planning. Nomura has been something of a scapegoat for FF fans to blame for everything they don't like about the series, but the remake going in a different direction wasn't something born out of contempt for the source material or a desire to overwrite it. This wasn't a situation where a new adaptation is passed off to the B team or a separate studio who specializes in remakes. This was largely the same team that created the first game, and it definitely shows. You can't end up making a product like this without having a deep understanding and respect for the original property. No other group of people were better equipped to retell this story, but things still ended up going the way they did because even those same people are no longer the same people they were 2 decades ago. They've worked on many other games since then, gotten new inspirations, new experiences. The cultural context in which the original game was released can't be replicated. What was groundbreaking back then no longer is today. Those goofy yet charming Roblox field models were a result of the developers' inexperience with 3D. If 7 released just a couple years later when they had gotten some more experience, we could have gotten something that looked very different. Personal struggles especially can have a profound effect on art. Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi has said that 7's theme of life was something that he'd been thinking about ever since his mother passed when he was working on Final Fantasy 3, and 7 was the first time that this theme was really brought to the forefront. That headspace isn't something that can be recreated. A one-for-one remake built from the ground up is an impossible task because no one can catch lightning in a bottle twice. I think that remakes should explore new themes and ideas, and it'd be a waste not to. I didn't like 7 Remake as much as the original, but I still enjoy being able to play a game with well-realized versions of these characters I already know and love. The sequel could still end up being a pile of hot garbage, but as long as the original remains accessible on modern platforms, revisiting that game will always be an option. A bad remake isn't going to reach into my head and retroactively ruin my love for the first game. It can and should be something that stands on its own. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter if a remake is faithful, it just matters if it's good. That's what I think anyways. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and thank you to the folks at Brilliant.org for sponsoring this video. Brilliant is the best way to learn math and computer science concepts interactively. It's an online learning platform with a unique approach to teaching these subjects. I know they're not exactly the most approachable topics, but that's exactly what Brilliant helps to change. The lessons guide you through interactive puzzles and problems so that you learn by doing. Each problem has these detailed visual aids that make it clear and easy to visualize each concept. I'm an engineering major, and it can get overwhelming flipping through textbook for hours on end. It's incredibly refreshing being able to mess around with these ideas in a low-stakes environment. Even if you're not a nerd like me, Brilliant's got you covered. The platform has thousands of lessons with new ones added every single month. They cover everything from basic algebra to contemporary topics like AI and neural networks. There's something here for learners at every level, so you can choose whatever works best for you in helping you reach your goals. To try everything Brilliant has to offer, free, for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/nasu or click the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription.
You wanna see me do it again?